Okay. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. My name is David Montejano. I'm the director of the Center for Latino Policy Research. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our continuing Friday seminar series. And today we have Dr. Nicolas Vaca, who will be talking about his recently published book, Presumed Alliance. Dr. Vaca is an award-winning journalist. He's an attorney, an author, and a visiting lecturer in the Department of Sociology at UC Davis. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School, and he holds a PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley. And as I just mentioned, he recently published Presumed Alliance, the unspoken conflict between Latinos and blacks, and what it means for America. And this is the subject of our Friday seminar today. As commentators, we have Professor Hardy Fry, Professor Emeritus of University of California, Santa Cruz in sociology. Hardy worked in the Deep South in the 1960s as an organizer of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He is a scholar of the Civil Rights Movement and an associate producer of Freedom on My Mind, which chronicles the Mississippi Voter Registration Project from 1961 to 64. And he recently directed the University of California system-wide urban community school collaboration. Our second commentator is Professor Carlos Munoz, also Professor Emeritus of Ethnic Studies here at UC Berkeley. Carlos was a founding chair of the first Mexican-American Studies department in the nation in 1968 at Cal State Los Angeles, and a founding chair of the National Association of Chicano and Chicano Studies, or NACS. He has authored numerous works on the Mexican-American political experience and on African-American and Latino political coalitions. His book, Youth Identity, Power, the Chicano Movement, won the Gustavus Meyer Book Award. He received his PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School in 1973 and currently is relaxing as Professor Emeritus.
I'm working more now than ever, but I'm also relaxed.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over then to Dr. Vaca.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for having me here. And it's also really good to come back and see a lot of old friends. Hardy and I were graduate students together at the Department of Sociology at Berkeley. We were one of the first cohorts of minorities recruited to the department by Bob Launer. And so it's kind of nice to come back and see Hardy, who looks younger than ever, and to talk about the book. The book came about as a result of my writing for a California lawyer. I had published numerous articles in the California Lawyer on a variety of issues, some were actually short stories. And I got an agent put together the book of short stories, and we decided to try and market it to HarperCollins, who had just come out with an imprint called Rayo Press. Rayo Press is interesting in and of itself because it is a press that's dedicated to publishing books to Latinos in the United States. And the director is a fellow by the name of Rene Alegria, a Chicano out of Arizona. And during our various conversations, I told him what a phenomenal thing it was, and he was being very self-deprecating. I said, no, you don't understand. In the 1970s, somebody had said HarperCollins was going to develop an imprint devoted to Chicanos. Everybody would have just laughed. I said, so this is a real interesting phenomenon, and it's also the reason why this book came about. This book came about because of the 2000 census. The 2000 census revealed that Latinos were approximately 35 million, African Americans were 36 million. The growth between 1990 and 2000 for the Latino population was phenomenal. People had thought it was going to grow. They didn't realize it was going to grow quite this much. So that was the genesis of it. I wanted to know what impact the number of Latinos was having on the relationship with African Americans. Now, as Hardy can attest, during the 1970s, there was this presumption of an alliance between Latinos and African Americans. We were a minority, we were peoples of color, We had our own respective histories of suffering, and to be perfectly honest, in those days it was Mexican Americans and African Americans. So that was the emphasis, and there was this presumption that we were aligned. Third world movement in San Francisco State was another good example of it. So I wanted to see what had happened in the relationship between the two groups. And I wanted to do it outside of an academic setting. Because to be perfectly honest, perfectly frank, in academic settings we tend to be a little too politically correct and not address some of these issues. So when HarperCollins agreed to publish this research, I was really grateful. I began the book by talking about what I called the Latino tsunami, the drowning of America. And essentially what I did was look at the census tract and not only focus on the Southwest where Latinos were growing in tremendous numbers. Right now in California we're about over a third of the population. But I also wanted to focus on new areas where Latinos had never shown up before. South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and New York City. And what they all demonstrated to me, the data demonstrated to me, was that we were moving, and when I say we, it's largely Mexicans and Central Americans who are coming into the United States now. We're not only bypassing the traditional stopping points like Texas and California, they're going directly to these places. In fact, there was a study conducted by the Pew Hispanic Center which identified something like 18 locations which they call hypergrowth, where the population of Latinos had grown something like 300% over the 10-year period. Now, when you look at the base number, it's not significant because 300% of 10 is not that significant. But the fact that they were growing so fast was really astounding to a lot of people. So, with that in mind, and I also talked about the fact that the Latino population is going to continue to grow in astronomical numbers. I trace a little bit of the immigration history, beginning with the 1900s, used David's book to some extent, but I also focus on the fact that more recently we have immigration proposals both by the Democratic Party and by the Republican Party that really demonstrate that there's really no willingness to stop the immigration, legal or otherwise. And in fact, in the most recent research that I've been doing, I've discovered that as a result of Bush's immigration proposal, there's been a tremendous increase of illegal immigration from Mexico to the United States. The Border Patrol has questioned people they've stopped, and they said, we want to get to the United States before the amnesty takes place, therefore we take advantage of it. There is no doubt that over the next 10 to 15 years, Latino population is going to continue to grow at astronomical numbers. I use the number in there that by the year 2050, we're going to represent 25% of the U.S. population. I think that's wrong. I think it's going to be more like 30%, maybe even higher, depending on fertility rates and also the continuing rate of immigration. I had a chapter in which I discussed Latino and African Americans in Los Angeles as it related to municipal jobs, and how as the Latino population grew, they started challenging the African Americans who had been in the public entity jobs beforehand. And the phenomena that arose from that was this. African Americans thought there, and they thought also in Compton, which I'll discuss a bit later, that the jobs, the public entity jobs, the public sector jobs, was an entitlement. It was an entitlement based on the history of the African American suffering, and also because of the activism of the African American and civil rights movement. Essentially what they're saying was, look, we suffered, we struggled, we're entitled. You guys came along afterwards, now you're trying to take advantage of something that rightfully belongs to us. I quote various African American union leaders, African American leaders, and Latinos who were in this constant conflict with each other. I have a chapter in there on, it's called Who's the Leader of the Civil Rights Ban, Latinos' Role in Brown versus Board of Education. It's really a discussion of a case called Mendez versus City of Westminster. I'm not going to talk about that one. That's something you might be interested in because Mendez versus City of Westminster was a precursor to Brown versus Board of Education. Very little known fact. The tactics, the strategy that was employed in Mendez versus Westminster was taken whole cloth and applied to Brown versus Board of Education. There's nothing wrong with that because many of the lawyers in Mendes versus Westminster were African Americans. They had come to help out in that particular lawsuit, but saw the value, particularly the effect of discrimination and separate schooling on individual students, the use of the social sciences for the first time in this kind of a case. They really saw it as a blueprint. Columbia and Yale Law Review had articles on it, but it's kind of a forgotten chapter in the Brown versus Board of Education, largely because it was not a U.S. Supreme Court case and therefore never became the law of the land. I focused on what I called the big ticket items. And I looked at the 2001 mayoral election in Los Angeles where you had Antonio Villaraigosa, who was running against a white candidate by the name of James Hahn. Antonio Villaraigosa was a Mexican-American who had a long history of working with African-Americans beginning in high school. And when he began his mayoral run, he actually thought he had a good shot of creating this coalition between himself and the African-Americans. What he did not take into account was two factors. Number one, African-Americans had absolutely no reason to create a coalition with Latinos. And the reason for that was because the Hahn family had a long history with the African-American community of doing right by them. He delivered in South Central. He was in many ways the first black city official, the way some people consider Clinton to be the first black president. That's exactly the way he was viewed in certain black communities. And so the other reason was that African Americans were afraid that because Latinos were in competition with them, they had been, all along they had seen this competition, that if someone like Villaraigosa got into power, he would, in the words that I quote in there, toss us all out. There was a real fear that that was really going to happen. Now, there was nothing in Antonio's background to suggest that, but there was that real fear that that was going to happen. These two factors together combined to give James Hahn something like 80% of the African American vote when it all settled down. And I was interviewed on a radio program, and there was an African American sociologist from UC San Diego who was extremely upset with me because of it. And she says, well, the problem is that we have to get together, we have to work together to overtake and overthrow the white power structure. And I said to her, then why did the African Americans vote for Antonio Villaraigosa? And then she said, well, there was reasons for that. Well, and I said, that's exactly right. There was no obligation on the part of the African American voters in Los Angeles to vote for Villaraigosa simply because he was Latino. You know, in the conflict theory of sociology, these two groups were looking out for their self-interest. And you have to also understand that Latinos had seen Bradley 20 years as mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And they said, well, it's now our time. Didn't happen. I use that as an example of a failure of a coalition that was really given Antonio Villaraigosa the title of being the first Chicano, Mexican American, Latino mayor of Los Angeles in recent history. Mind you, he's running again. And he's running against Park, who's African Americans, the ex-police chief, and the African American voters are now in a real quandary because there's a perception that Park is not going to win. So now what do? That's something I think is going to resolve itself. I think Villaraigosa is going to be the next mayor. I also wanted to look at a situation where Latinos were in power and African Americans were shut out. So I went to Miami. I looked at Miami. Now, Miami provided me with two things. One was the ability to deconstruct the Latino monolith, which is to say, everybody talks about Latinos as we're this one monolith. And I purposely use Miami because Miami's Cuban. It's Cuban American. The history of the Cuban American in Miami is very different from the Mexican American in the Southwest. It's very different from the Puerto Rican in New York City. And what I discovered in doing the research in Miami was that the Cuban American population didn't care about the African American history, the African American civil rights, and nothing exemplified it more than when Nelson Mandela announced he was going to come to visit Miami to collect a check 2 weeks after he was released from prison in South Africa. Unfortunately for Nelson Mandela, he had had an interview, a national interview, in which he thanked Fidel Castro for his support and his work.
Good for you.
Huh? I didn't hear that. Well, I think that was great.
Yeah, it's good for you.
Well, everybody thought it was great except for the Cubans.
Well, kind of Cuban, but white one Cuban.
Well, wait, no. We'll talk about this a little later.
Yeah, right.
But no, but the Cubans basically were going to, there were various events arranged to honor him. And soon as that came about, all of these offers were withdrawn. And there was a huge confrontation in one of these convention halls in which the African Americans were using the name of a police officer who had killed African Americans. By the way, I glossed over that. But African Americans have been being killed on I should say, a regular basis. But there have been several incidents with African Americans being killed by Latino police officers. And I mean of various ilks, not only Cuban American. And so in this confrontation in this convention hall, the Cuban Americans were yelling to the African Americans to go back where they came from, Detroit, I don't know. And the African Americans were yelling the name of the police officer who had been convicted of killing the African American individual. Situation did not change appreciably. In fact, African Americans will tell you because they don't speak Spanish, they're effectively shut out of the economic and political landscape of Miami. The next chapter, I come back to Compton, and Hardy just told me that he's from Compton, or lived in Compton. And in fact, I was in Philadelphia last week making a similar kind of presentation, discovered several people from Compton there, which I found interesting. Compton, for those of you who aren't aware, is now approximately 56 to 60% Latino. It used to be all black. It was, same thing with South Central. And I went there because I wanted to see what was happening. It was a good example of the changing demographics in California and the impact it was having on the black population. And there were several issues at hand there. First one was that you had no Latino on the city council. And you had, I think, one member on the school board who was Latino. The public employment jobs were overwhelmingly held by African Americans, even though the demographics had changed. And there was this ongoing conflict between both groups. Latinos wanted somebody of their own on the city council, and in fact, they had entered into what they thought was an agreement with the then mayor, Omar Bradley, only to have Omar break his promise to them. Omar essentially told the Latinos, you want to become members of the city council, you legalize, you get citizenship, you get your registered to vote, and then you vote whenever you're allowed. It was blatant. There was no toning down of the words. At the same time, you also had a kind of a Rodney King incident there with an African American police officer and a Latino kid. So the conflict was really significant. It was palpable. It was evident, and it's ongoing. I was there about 2 months, 3 months after the book came out. C-SPAN Books filmed me there at Compton Community College, and the audience, which was about 300, was about 75 African American, 25 Latino. And they got an opportunity to ask questions after I made my presentation. And the kinds of perceptions that they had of each other was really, really interesting. And it concluded with one young lady making the statement as she got up to the microphone and said, well, I don't really know what's going on, but I do know this, and that Mexicans teach their kids to hate blacks. I didn't know what to say. Fortunately, somebody else got up and made some kind of a comment. But the fact that you had this kind of very graphic statements at the college level at Compton Community College suggest to you the kinds of tensions that's going on in Compton and in South Central. Later on that evening, I went to S1 bookstore to do a book signing. And again, I was stunned by the number of Latinos in South Central and how much South Central was changing from an African American community to a Latino community. That was the situation I encountered in Compton. The next chapter, I went to Houston because Houston had a 2001 mayoral race as well. And in there, you had a really fascinating situation. You had a situation where the incumbent was an African American mayor by the name of Lee Brown, who had done everything right. He had created, one of his closest advisors was a Mexican American. He had created a advisory committee who was Mexican American. He met with him on a regular basis. The city had an affirmative action program. The lion's share of the awards, the contracts went to Latinos. And yet, when he was challenged by a Cuban American by the name of Orlando Sanchez was considered to be anti-Latino. He was conservative in terms of the immigration policies. He had some really outrageous theories on bonds for criminal felons. And he also was against the affirmative action program. I mean, this was a case where the Latinos voted for him. It was cutting off your nose to spite your face. But he kept saying, the time is ours. It's time we have one of our own in the mayor's office. And the mayor's office in Houston is a very powerful office. So that's what he was after. That's how he pumped them up. And he almost won. Got 70% of the Latino vote. He also ran again, by the way, and got royally whipped. He was unable to create the kind of coalition. He was also running against a white candidate, not a black candidate. And the African Americans voted for the white candidate, and a lot of Latinos voted for the white candidate. So he was kind of gone. During the time that I was doing the research, and I was talking to the editor, he kept saying, you know, Nick, God, you're in California a lot, you're in the Southwest. You know, I know you did Miami, but how about the East Coast? So I said, okay, let's look at New York. The other reason I did New York was because I had been told by Puerto Ricans that the relationship between Puerto Ricans and African Americans on the East Coast was radically different than the relationship between Mexican Americans and African Americans on the West Coast. That because the Cuban Americans are to some degree Afro-Latinos, they have a different relationship. And that I should look at that because it really is different. So I did. I did the 2001 mayoral race where Fernando Ferrer, Puerto Rican, was running for mayor. Now, Fernando Ferrer had run before. But you have to also understand that New York City actually had an African-American mayor. Dinkins, you might remember him, as being the mayor. And he was elected on a coalition with African-Americans and Latinos. So Fernando said, well, you know what? I can do this too. I can create this coalition. So who does he approach? He approaches Al Sharpton. Because Al Sharpton was one of the more visible, high-profile African Americans. And he says to him, I want to create this coalition. I'm running for mayor. Al Sharpton says, okay, this is what I want. Now, mind you, he did this in public. He did it through the newspaper. He didn't do it in some back room where these kinds of deals are cut. He did it openly. He said, you're going to give up your position as Bronx borough president. I want you to support my candidate. And then I want you to give me a blank check to support whoever I nominate. There was another position he wanted to nominate the African American to. Unfortunately, he made this announcement on the newspapers, and then Fernando said, if I accede to that, then I'm going to be seen as nothing more than your toady. So he said, I can't do that. So they're going back and forth. Meantime, Al Sharpton decides, well, I'm sure he's saying decides, he had a long history of protesting, and he goes to the Viejas to protest the bombing there. And he thinks that when he goes there, if he gets arrested, he's convinced he's going to get arrested, that he's going to get a slap on the hand. That's what was happening to everybody getting arrested. So he goes there with 3 or 4 other political members of the, I think it was the equivalent of our city council, two were Puerto Rican, I think it was, and he goes there, he gets arrested, but he doesn't get a slap in the hand. He gets 90 days in federal prison. And that's when he starts losing the weight, by the way. His own self-imposed Atkins diet. He goes there, and mind you, when he's still there, you have Fernando sending emissaries into the federal prison, wanting to say, look, are you going to support me or not? And he's not getting an answer. Meantime, he's trying to work with Dinkins to get his support, because if you're going to create a true Black Latino coalition in New York City, you're going to need Dinkins' support. Well, Dinkins apparently gets miffed, because at one interview, they asked Fernando Ferreira, of all the past mayors, who's your favorite? And Fernando did not say Dinkins fast enough, apparently. Dinkins gets upset, throws his support to one of the other candidates. Eventually, Sharpton gets out, they have a meeting, he throws his support, my God, this is, a dollar short a day later, something like that. And so what happens? Eventually you have the election, you do have a crossover vote from African Americans to Fernando, but he doesn't get enough to go to the runoff. So in the book I said, well, is this really a coalition? I said, you can argue both ways. You can say, yeah, it was, and no, it wasn't, and you should have done it earlier, and it would have worked out. I mean, imagine Mel Sharpton and Dinkins said, yeah, we're behind it. It would have really, really done a lot for his campaign, but that didn't happen. I end the book by talking about visions of the future, and I put in there a mathematical axioms, which has gotten in more trouble than anything else in the book. And in there, basically, I say, look, there's certain things that are real now, and we got to relate, we got to understand this and accept this as Latinos and African Americans. Number one, Latinos are the largest minority, and African Americans are never going to regain this position again. It's a reality. When I said that in Philadelphia, I could hear a gasp go through the entire audience, because the audience was 95% African American. And I said to them, look, on July 1st, 2003, when Latinos became the largest minority, nobody knocked on my door, either at home or the office, and said, hey, here's a prize, buddy. You're now the largest minority in California, in the United States. You deserve something. I said, it's a reality. That's all it is. It's a reality of the numbers. It doesn't change the consciousness of American society vis-a-vis African Americans, the history of slavery, the Jim Crow laws, the institutional racism. But the fact is, you now have this huge minority group that you're going to have to contend with. I also, in the book I also state that the other axiom is Latinos and African Americans are going to have different goals, are going to have different objectives. And each one is entitled to work towards their own. And if you want a true coalition between the two, you have to begin with that as a premise. You can no longer simply, because we're African Americans, Latinos, we're going to work together jointly and move forward. I actually think the best thing would be if deals are struck between the two, specific goals are set forth, you reach them and you disband and you move on. So that's kind of what the book is about. I was intrigued. I came here to listen to David talk about the Huntington book, the Who Are We? And I was really intrigued by that because I frequently end my lectures by talking about that book. And I say that, look, not only did we surpass the African Americans in terms of numbers, and that concerned African Americans. And in the New York Times article, when they wrote about this, they talked about the BET website. It went ballistic when those numbers came out. That it was, the comments about Latinos and African Americans were just blood-curdling in some instances. I said, not only was that happening, but you had white academics looking at the numbers and really being stunned by it. According to Huntington, we now represent, and mostly Mexicans, for very good reason, we're 60% of the 40 million. We represent the greatest threat to American institutions. The fact that a lot of the stuff that he says has no statistical backgrounds or underpinnings seems to be immaterial. And second, what I did for my presentation in Philadelphia is I went to a book called By the Sweat of Our Brow, which I used for some of my research. And I pulled out statements made by nativists of the 1920s and set them right next to Huntington. And my God, they were almost identical. The only difference was Huntington is from Harvard. Nativists were from the Southwest. Whether it's the language, whether it's fertility, whether it's the fact that we're going to retake the Southwest, those statements were there by both. Neither one of them had the foundation or the statistical data or surveys. One of the most fascinating things about Huntington is his insistence that Spanish is going to dominate American culture, when in fact by third generation most of them don't speak Spanish. I think what he did, he does what everybody else does. He mistakes the new immigrant with all Latinos. Tommy Romano was one of my mentors here. I like to call it the replenishment theory. You know, we move out of the barrios, new ones come in, and they look just like us. So everything's planned, nothing's changed. So anyway, that's the book. It's gotten mixed reviews. It sold out the first 2 weeks. I've been on PBS. Tony Brown had me in his journal, and I will tell you that almost every African American that has interviewed me and I've talked to afterwards has said, about time somebody talked about the elephant in the room. This is important, significant, and we got to get it out. Okay.
Well, now, ready to comment on the elephant in the room. It's
a big one.
It's hard to cry.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. And Nick, 35 years we've been knowing each other. We started graduate school same day in Berkeley. So it's two old colleagues battling here. Same thing we fought about 35 years ago.
Right. And so,
Well, first thing is, I wrote a few notes in at the. When I read this book, I kept asking myself, why my fellow graduate student colleague was writing this book. Surely all of us who took race relations courses at Berkeley, in the Berkeley Department of Sociology, knew tensions always occurred between racial and ethnic groups as they struggled to move up in the stratification system. For example, Jews and, in fact, blacks. I mean, that's just kind of a basic race relations argument in sociology. So we knew about the tension. I mean, some of us, at least at the academic level, knew about the tension. So I don't find anything necessarily that striking about it. I mean, it happens. Okay? And then I kept asking myself, as I kept reading, I said, trying to understand why Nick is making this argument. And I say Nick because I think I learned that for 35 years. Why is he making this argument? And then I said, well, this is really an argument. I don't even know if I should participate in the panel because this is an argument between Chicano, Latino activists and intellectuals, not necessarily blacks. There might be the facts that they exist, conflict exists, but this is a logical argument here going on. You're not just reporting the data, you're making an ideological position in this book. Okay? In fact, the first time I heard about the book, I was sitting at home, and the commentator came on NPR television news and said Nick Vaca, and I jumped up, of course, and he started talking about Nick's book. Hardly a place, you make that presentation, I said to myself, hardly a place where you'll find the people who need to understand this discussion. The elite listen to NPR, the masses don't necessarily do. But I'm glad to hear that you've been with the masses. Okay? Now, Linda Chavez talks about, in the first part of the book, the neoconservative activist, comments on the presumed alliances. She said, with grace and scholarly attention to detail, Vaca demonstrates that Latinos' interests that are not always identical to those of blacks. She says, Nick shows that the presumed alliance between the two groups is less a fact than is a product of, is less a fact, but is a product of wishful thinking on the part of civil rights activists. Although Chavez has kind words for this work by Nick, I find this work, like Ramos, the head of the Western State Assembly, Senate, to be somewhat sometimes they're not as rigorous as I would want it to be. A lot of times, when they get these data, you print. If it's not, it's a little bit above anecdotal stuff. You talk about what was in the newspaper, and you talk about comments made in the newspaper, and you don't analyze. You don't give us some hard data. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
You talk about jobs in Compton,
Right.
in the Valley in Compton. But and you also when you talk about LA County, you do the same thing. You talk about which is essentially a struggle between middle class Latinos and middle class blacks. They're public sector jobs, most of them.
Right.
All right, and they're struggling over this. But you could have proven, and if blacks say, look, the Latinos are coming in and taking our jobs. In those sections which you were looking at, you could have proved by showing the data.
I did do that.
Well, you didn't show the data about the question on how many jobs they lost. You talk about how many they hired in terms of population. Okay?
By the way, in my defense, that was the fourth draft of the book. I was specifically instructed to make it for the trade. I have a stack this high of material that I relied on. Now, it may not be in there, but in fact, in that chapter, I relied heavily on academic articles that appeared in various journals.
Nick, I can't review what I don't see. All right? All right? I mean, I can't do it. Give me a break. All right? So, it's just something. And insightful. I think it's insightful maybe for a general population, but people know there has been conflict and there's tension. That's nothing new. Okay? So the person then has to say, well, what are we doing here? Why are you putting it out there? You put it out there because you take a variable of population and you say the numerical growth. And that's how you start off the book.
That's right.
Talk about the numerical growth. And part of your argument is that this tremendous growth in the population is going to necessarily, you never really actually say it, but you suggest very strongly that it's going to necessarily mean it's going to be transferable to, in fact, political power.
Yes.
Okay? And then I thought about that and I said, wait a minute. African Americans have been, what, 23 million, 24 million, 25 million, etc.
Right.
And yet, Jewish communities is about 3 million people, and yet, compare our politics and political power versus Jewish people in this country. We get slaughtered. All right? So that's not necessarily a relationship, I would argue, between necessary numerical numbers, and that's a big component of your work, all the way through. That as this grows, you're going to get politics. Now, and there's a slight contradiction in there.
Well, no, first of all, that's not what I say. I mean, I point out in the chapter in Houston, particularly, that numerical numbers do not necessarily.
That's right. You say that. You're absolutely right. You say that when you're talking about Houston, but you continue to do that throughout the whole book. Okay. At the end of the book, in your action, you come back to the question of numerical numbers, don't you? Okay. Just want to make sure I'm
I'm going to
clear.
inject a thought here. I think it would be best if you could wait until we finish.
I don't have a couple.
We'll get a chance to defend yourself.
It's a lawyer in me.
I know, right?
Yeah, right. So that's what I thought.
Yeah, I got to leave at 5 o'clock.
Okay.
There's a lot of important people all over here that want to also get involved, so I just want to, I'm prepared to do a 10-minute show.
Okay, all right. Now, let me make this simple. There's also in your book, the two major variables that you use is you use Hamilton and Carmichael, and you talk about self-interest.
Yeah.
On the other side, you talk about the growth in population and the significant transfer of power. Is that fair? Okay. Now, the problem is, if you're writing this book to try to explain to us why, as you say in the book, why we should, in fact, understand why you're just laying it out on the table, because we have to lay it out on the table to get a new direction, to start a new analysis of our relationship.
Right.
But on the other hand, you got the variable of self-interest, and you got over here, you talk about this population, and you show how the population is growing. My problem with it is this. That could, if Afro-Americans perceive that these numbers are going to be as horrendous as you said they are, and I have no reason to argue not. If they're going to, and if we're talking about self-interest, it's still in the interest of Afro-American people to maintain political control, or have some political power as long as they could. Why wouldn't they do exactly what happened in LA? Why wouldn't they join a coalition of, in fact, white elites? Why wouldn't they join that coalition? Because you said in your work, that, hey, we're coming, man, and you got to give it up. Okay? And so what happened in New York, I mean, in your Los Angeles example, what happened in your Los Angeles example is they joined with Yorley, and you said, why are they joining with Mayor, not the supervisor, not Yorley, Hans is that, okay? Okay. Now, come on, okay? No, yeah, it's a big difference. But and one of the things you don't deal with enough when you talk about Hans, you mentioned it. There was a gap between Afro Americans of a certain age,
Right.
who, and I lived in LA at that time, who in fact knew Hans. I mean, Hans was like, Bill Clinton. I go along with that. The black community, he had been producing for the black community.
Right.
All right? And the young Afro Americans and et cetera. You don't deal with, people come in. Okay? Finally, and also by the self-interest, why if I'm a Latino, if they're coming across the border, do not know the history of Afro Americans?
Right.
Why necessarily would I, in fact, not have a kind of heart, do not care about necessarily, because I have two options if I'm a Latino. I can stay in this country and work, or I can go home, which is very different from Afro Americans. Okay? Now, one or two more points. One or two that I'm over with, that I let you go. Because, okay, Vaca, you dismissing something else. You dismiss very casually the whole role of the elite, the political elite. You don't talk about the fact that they possibly can manipulate the whole situation. Another reviewer said the same thing. All right? I believe his name Morales. Ed Morales said the same thing. The fact is that it's that way for real. But the fact is, you're telling Latinos. But the fact is that you create a situation. You say if these guys can do what? They can manipulate the situation. And in a lot of situations, what you're going to have that happening all over the country. If you buy into your argument and your action, which got you in a lot of trouble, you're right. If this is going to continue to grow, and the mindset is you got your self-interest, and the self-interest is to get yours, and work with nobody else, there's no reason because we got the population proper number, then why wouldn't you say, hey, wait a minute, I got to deal with something else here. What happens if black society becomes a temporary and potentially a long-time ally of the white elite? They can certainly keep Latinos out.
For a while.
Well, okay, we can talk about it for 3,000 francs, okay? but that's the question, Nick. And finally, see, the problem I had, the work, I'm really concerned about this work because I also looked at who made comments about it, and that's important. Books and these things are very interesting to look at it. Look, the point is...
Bob Blonder made it.
Well, Bob Blonder was our professor. We know that. Okay.
One of the leading writers on that.
Yeah, right. But we wrote it together with him. But that is the question. The question is this, Nick. This book can potentially can be a stone of fire, although we have to discuss relationship between Latino and Black, especially very powerful and I'm concerned because I agree with Morales, the Puerto Rican, you say, that says, look, this book for a Latino coming to this country and just learning about this country will read your book and say the same identical thing that every immigrant group has learned when they come to this country. That is, pick the blacks as your target, not to be black, not to work with, not to cooperate with, do all that stuff because that ain't the way you make it in American society. The way you make it in American society is being anti-black.
That's right.
All right? And not only is this relevant in terms of Latinos, it's also relevant in terms of blacks from the Caribbean. Particularly in New York. We know in New York, for example, Nick, we know that when they ask Caribbeans, what about black Americans? The first thing Caribbeans say, they're lazy, they don't want to work, and all this. So in other words, I conclude with this, it's allowing you, and also one of the way, when you write this book is, when you read this book, man, the choice of words is very important you use. I mean, the words that you're using, man, you could use another one, and it wouldn't have been as as provocative as the choice you use. And so, as a consequences, one reads the book, and he gets the feeling that you have another agenda. I don't know what that agenda is, but that's what you get. And as a consequences, I wish I had brought my glasses. But the book, I could most likely have the effect of reinforcing what generational immigrants have been taught, that estrangement from blackness is key to success in America. And we have, and as I said, and that's one of the things that I worry about the book. Is that the elite can read this book, and if they give it to, if you don't know the history of Afro-American experience, why would you necessarily, you read this book and say, well, hey, they're not going to be, they ain't no petition for being an ally. And in your example, you don't really take us into how can it work at first in Houston, which was when Brown, instead of Brown was from a PhD in criminology from Berkeley. He was up when we were here. You don't take that and contrast it. You don't necessarily take and contrast it. And you can't compare Cubans, white, middle-class Cubans in Miami with Latino farm workers from Mexico. And yet, but wait a minute. But yet, when you talk about Latinos throughout the book, I'm saying, wait a minute. I just got to work in South America a couple of years ago. I saw a lot of different groups. Do they all have the same mindset? You don't explain the complications of that for us. What you tell us is all it is the population got to grow. And that's going to bring it around. I don't buy it.
All right, let Carlos have his 10
Okay.
minutes, and then
Right. What I'm going to do is, and I generally don't do this because I like to also like Hardy, take my time and elaborate. But I think, in the interest of time, I'm going to read what my thoughts are about Nick's work.
I wish you had brought my glasses.
Yeah, and I want to first of all preface my remarks by making it clear that we would not be here if it were not for a third world strike in 1969 that was indeed not a presumed alliance, but it was indeed a very real alliance that, in particular, African Americans and Mexican Americans had a leading role in. There have been many examples throughout U.S. history, and some that I have been personally involved in the last 40 years, more recent history, that have featured Latino and Black united efforts and struggles against racial and class oppression, and they continue today. Specifically, and I wish I had time to elaborate about that, but this very day, right now, African Americans and Latino immigrant workers are uniting themselves as they have never united themselves before. The media, of course, always features the conflicts that take place among people of color in our society. Conflict is unfortunately a fact of life in the good old USA, but it takes place between and amongst all racial and ethnic groups in our society. It especially takes place between those of the dominant white culture, the most racist obviously, and those on the other side of the color line. Capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and homophobia have always generated conflict in our society and throughout the world. But history has also shown that united struggles against racial, class, gender, and sexual oppression have also been a fact of life. If we are committed to peace and social justice for all, then it is important that we write about that latter point in the context of our scholarship and research and writing. And this is what ethnic studies should be all about. If we simply contribute to the underscoring of the reality of conflict without placing it in critical perspective and dealing with the question of what can and must be done to end it at the expense of people of color, the working class, and all the folks that are placed in the basket of other or different in our society, then we're not doing our job. Next, come up with mathematical axioms that I want to just kind of briefly touch on. Axiom 1, he says, Latinos are now the largest minority group in the USA. True, they are the largest population in the USA. Not true, they're not the largest minority group. Latinos, all of us, represent 17 distinct cultures and nations of the Americas. We're much more culturally diverse people compared to African Americans in our society. We represent all racial groups. We all know, or should know, that we originally came about as a mixture of indigenous and Spanish conquistador blood. What most do not know and should know is that we are also African and Asian, okay? By virtue of the fact that slavery transcended all barriers. There were also African slaves, there were Filipino slaves in Mexico, for example. There have been all kinds of slavery in our American societies, American plural. Okay, I don't buy this thing about us being Americans, puro pedo. We got to once and for all talk about the USANs, I guess. We're USANs, I don't know. We're like a better team, but that's another topic. We share much in common. Obviously, we have differences. And we have differences because, indeed, we have unique experiences, historical and otherwise, that we need to take into account. Okay? There have been more, they have, at least these kinds of things, in terms of what the reality is about the political paradigm in our society, has to do with the fact that that is still the dominant paradigm. You know, ethnic group politics, interest group politics, you know what I'm saying? And that's the problem that I have with Nick's book, in the sense that it's completely devoid of a critique of the nature of the political system that we find ourselves in. It stinks. It's corrupt. There's a two-party dictatorship in our society that must come down. And that is the problem, unfortunately, that most blacks and Latinos are mired in. And the Latino leadership I'm not at all impressed with, either locally, statewide, or national, for lacking the vision and the perspective and the critical consciousness to understand that reality. I'm saying you do. I'll tell you what you do. Action number 2. Oh, it's a footnote to that other one. This explains why, to show another example why indeed, blacks happen to have more political leverage in traditional mainstream politics, is because they have more unity. Obviously, there's less cultural diversity amongst black folks, and every black person in this society, from the baby to the adult to the elder, knows about slavery. All right. That's in the African American psyche, as it should be, and never be forgotten. We, on the other hand, are a colonized people. Okay, we have to deal with what I call the colonized mind. The majority of us don't understand the fact that, hey, you know what? We have been colonized in different, or oppressed rather, in different terms than blacks, but nevertheless the same things are there. And so we need to deal with that, I think, to understand the complexity of what it is. Why it is so hard to build multiracial coalitions, but at the same time, why it is so necessary to engage in that process. Axiom 3. Nick says, Latinos are not responsible for the plight of African Americans.
Whatever said they were.
Obviously. Now I say this is true, but it is also true that African Americans are not responsible for the plight of Latinos. Okay? Axiom number 4. I bid above. Latinos come to the table with clear conscience because of that. This may be true for some Latinos, but the majority of Latinos go to the table with a racist mindset toward blacks, as already touched on by my colleague Hardy Fry. Latinos, as the case is with all people in this society of ours, in good old USA, have been products of a dominant culture and institutions rooted in the values and ideas of white supremacy. We must never forget that. Axiom number 5. Latino immigration is fact of life. Yes, it is. It's always been historical fact of life in the U.S. Since the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, with the possible exception of the indigenous peoples, who themselves can be argued were also, immigrants at one time from Asia. Okay, if we want to put it go that far, and from Africa, because I just came back from Veracruz, teaching in Veracruz, and I can tell you I saw evidence in Veracruz that Africans discovered America long before Columbus. Okay, we can talk about that later. And also I met with Afro mestizo people. That's what African Mexicans call themselves, okay, in Mexico today. And we don't know much about them, okay? And the reason we don't is because, like racism here, racism in good old Mexico is alive and well, has been historically, okay? They are in denial over there, okay? That indeed, Africans once were there helping to build a nation of Mexico, okay? So we can understand that, and we need to learn more about that. Axiom number 6. Immigrants will compete for unskilled jobs with African Americans. Yes and no. The fact is that immigrants largely compete, end quote, for the unskilled jobs that U.S. workers do not want, including African Americans. This is an argument that is used by those who want to perpetuate division between Latinos and blacks. And they do a damn good job of it. Nick concludes that, quote, tomorrow's America will be an America greatly influenced by Latinos and their culture. Latinoism, as he puts it, will sit atop America's existing social, political, economic, and legal structures. To the contrary, I argue, the way things are going, from what I have seen, both in practice, in struggles, in the real world of up there, and also the academy, is that we will continue to be at the bottom of all those structures. The USA is becoming a neo-apartheid society, ruled by white male patriarchy and representing the class interest of a global capitalism. Okay? This is how I see it. This is my response to your call. I got a lot more, but
I got a lot more too.
I want all of y'all to have a say on
Yeah,
this.
actually,
You take a few minutes?
I'll just take it real quick. First of all, I'm really glad that Hardy and Carlos are here, because this is the first time, this is the reaction I expected. I've never gotten this kind of reaction. Probably because this is the first academic setting in which I've been, in which the book has been analyzed. Generally, I've been on radio programs, TV programs, I've made presentations and the like. I happen to think that a lot of the concern is a misunderstanding of what this book is about. And by the way, Hardy, in addition to Linda Chavez, I also have.
I just picked her.
Don't give me that. You just picked her. I have Bob Blauner. I have Rudy Acuna, I think, in the hardback. I mean, you can't knock Rudy Acuna, right? Hey, wait a minute. Let me finish. You're the one that brought up the whole concept of being colonized people. Where'd that come from? Bob Blauner and Rudy Acuna.
I said it before they did.
Okay, well then you said it. By the way, that is totally, absolutely wrong. When you have somebody coming from Mexico to the United States, that person is not colonized. Since the 1920s, you would have mass immigration from Mexico to the United States voluntarily. That is not colonization.
What are the historical terms?
I don't care what.
Conversation in Mexico. Okay, all right.
No. This is. Anyway, let me finish.
Let's see if
This is important because Bob Blauner began the whole concept of internal colonialism that he borrowed from historians and sociologists and tried to apply it to the Latino United States. The problem with that is it might have made sense when you had the conquest of the Southwest, at which time you had 80,000 Latinos in the United States. We have 40 million now. Of those 40 million, 23, 24 are Mexican Americans. They came here voluntarily. And they came here voluntarily because Mexico sucks. Bottom line. I will tell you. I mean, you didn't say it. And when it sounds like a good book. Let me finish because this has been. I got the book number 2. You know, I am sick to death about people saying, "Oh yes, we're colonized people." I took my son to Mexico. I took him to Tijuana, which really is in Mexico, but it's not. So you tell the Mexicans they're that.
I mean, it's not, you know, it's a border town.
It's a border town, but it is Mexico. And you know what? You know, you saw, anybody who's been to Tijuana sees the indigenous population playing their guitars on the bridge, coming back, you know, extreme dire poverty. I asked my son when we got back, I said, Christian, what do you think about Mexico? He says, Dad, if I lived in Mexico, I try and get a boy across that border too. It's true. Unfortunately, Mexico has never been able to correct its economic and political order. And why? Oh, now we're going to blame the imperialism.
We're getting sidetracked.
Okay. The other question that was raised was that Latinos are not the largest minority. You know what? We're not a racial grouping. African Americans are a racial grouping. We are an ethnic grouping. And I'm the first one to say we've got to deconstruct the monolith of the Latino you're right, whoever said it, Cuban Americans share very little with Mexican Americans. I got attacked most viciously by the Puerto Ricans in New York City. I was on a radio program, TV program with James Brown, the football analyst. It was a remote video on America's Black Forum. In his studio in New York City, he had an African American woman and a Puerto Rican woman. I was in San Francisco. We're getting set up. They didn't realize I could hear everything they were saying. And Puerto Rican girl said, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He just doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about Mexicans. Mexicans aren't like us. And it was a real clear distinction. Look, you're preaching to the choir. I'm the one that believes that, in fact, Latinos should be deconstructed in terms of ethnicity, in terms of history, in terms of social and economic position. I'm the first one to argue that. So I've got no problem. But we have been lumped together as a group. And if you talk to a Cuban and say, you know what, you're not Latino, that's why you're crazy.
I don't understand, sir. How can you sit here and say you're not a group, yet your whole thesis throughout your book is Latino? You don't make that differentiation. You talk about Latino.
But I do make.
I was quiet. Look, you in your book, the argument you make, hold on, and you started out with the population growth. You don't say Puerto Ricans over here. One doesn't get the idea. I kept saying, wait a minute. I kept reading, but I kept saying, wait a minute. Yeah, I know you're talking about Puerto Ricans, Nicaraguans. You had Nicaraguans in there. You had Central American people in there. You had all these people, right? And I instruct my teachers, I just got to live in there for 2 years, and I know damn well they don't agree with each other that way. But the race question is a whole different question about race there. Okay, so but your whole premise for your argument is Latinos. You don't make the separation.
Well, I mean, I do make the separation in the various chapters. Do I not talk about the Cuban Americans? Do I not talk about the Puerto Ricans in New York City?
But when you talk about
I was quite good. And did I not talk about the Mexicans in Los Angeles?
But you're talking about in particular around a particular.
That's exactly right.
Excuse me. You're talking about you talk about in New York. You talk about New York is the only place in your book where you get some kind of understanding of dynamics between these groups. In LA, it's blacks and Latinos. In Houston, it's blacks and Latinos. In Miami, it's Cuban and blacks.
Not true. Houston, I pointed out, Orlando Sanchez was a blue-eyed white Cuban American, distinct from the Mexican American population, right?
Yeah. But the point is, why do you make the whole argument? What I want to know is, why then, if there is a differentiation between these groups that you're now making, what makes us believe that somehow, when it comes to the electoral politics, they're going to pull together the kind of unity that the Afro-American community has done because they have a common experience? A person in Nicaragua has none of this experience of a person in Cuba, and it has not been the same with a person in Mexico. And therefore, your whole argument begins to unravel because your assumption is that they're going to come here and somehow all come together and vote. And I don't see it. Now, maybe, and the question would be, and which you never address to a certain extent, is you never address the fact that there are, and so, Morales and another reviewer raised the same question, you never address the racial differences between Latinos who are coming here necessarily. You don't spend any time analyzing and say, wait a minute, what side of the, I mean, if you're from Guyana, if you're from Brazil, if you're one of those countries and you come here, who are you going to relate to? The black brothers in Harlem and Mexicans in the Southwest. You don't address it at all. And that's a very important question because even in Brazil, there's some kind of class and break down the cleavages. You don't address that. And that's what I'm saying. And so all I thought about was that these Latinos are going to come here, you're going to have this population grow, it's going to continue to grow, and we're going to continue to come, and then they're going to take political power. I don't know how you do that. And you never discuss organization. You never discuss the nature of Chicano organization at all. You don't talk about but that's how blacks, to a certain extent, got some of the political power they had. They learned a lot of that sophisticated from the Jewish community. Yeah, but you don't discuss that.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to let somebody else talk.
Oh, yeah,
but you're also asking for 4 different books from that one book. And what I like about it is that it inspired this creative thinking in your mind as a result of reading this book.
I'm getting old, it's true. I'm getting old.
I'd like to open it up, but I'd like Nick to answer one of the questions that Artie raised earlier, and that was, what was there an agenda? What was your agenda here when you wrote this? I mean, why emphasize conflict, and why not emphasize, for example, the history of alliances or cooperation?
It's my personal experience in the real world that I had seen conflict. We saw it here when we were graduate students at Berkeley. UC Davis, the big struggle at UC Davis over was which group is going to get the funding to create the ethnic groups. I mean, the ethnic studies program. That was it. In the real world, as a lawyer, in the business world, I see it every day. For example, I'll give you the best example. RTC. RTC is the Resolution Trust Corporation. It was set up after you had the bankruptcy of lending institutions. There was an actual program set up to give legal work and other kind of work to minorities. We called up saying, we would like to participate in that. They said to me, in no uncertain terms, this is an African American program. I said, but it says minority. He said, we realize that, but it's an African American program. Now you tell me why that would be. Let me give you the most recent example, which happened last Wednesday. When I was in Philadelphia, which is 48% African American, 8% Latino, and I spoke to the Minority Enterprise Week luncheon, 95% African American. The mayor came. And the mayor was talking about, we've got to get programs for the minority community. The minority community was the black community. And afterwards, let me finish. I didn't say anything.
Just in case.
So you see those divisions. So, and also, because I know that there are people like Carlos who are politically correct about this stuff and will always say that you'll emphasize the cooperation and that kind of stuff. And I thought it needed some balance, frankly.
I'm in the right in the center of the storm.
Yes.
And I can acknowledge this conflict.
Yes.
That's the nature. I mentioned that.
But it's not always the nature. I mean, you have conflict theory and you have functionalist theory.
Well, there you go. That's the problem. So you got to get away from those social science.
Hey, I'm teaching social one. I just learned these things.
You're right.
And that's the problem. See, I mean, the point is,
Professor Mandela has it.
But I actually have a question, which I'd like to interject here. I haven't read the book, but I gather from the comments that you made here that part of your thesis is that under certain circumstances, coalitions are possible.
Yes.
Between black and Latinos. Under other circumstances, coalitions probably will not take place.
That's correct.
And I've certainly experienced that myself on different campuses.
Go ahead.
My question is, I'm curious about you mentioned, growing Latino presence in the South. But the only one that we really talked about here is Florida. And I'm really curious about other states, like North Carolina and Georgia and so forth, where there are growing Latino populations. And it seems to me that if, in fact, there can be coalitions of blacks and Latinos in that, possibly this might make a difference in terms of the balance of power in some of these other states. And I'm curious to know what's going on in those states because I don't know and I haven't seen the position.
That's a really good question because I think you know that the Mexican American Defense Fund, MALDEF, opened its office in Atlanta. And it opened an office in Atlanta because they see that as the emerging area where Latinos are going to confront issues affecting their civil rights. It is projected by the U.S. Census by the year 10 years, Latinos will overtake African Americans in Georgia. I mean, it's phenomenal. Those are phenomenal numbers that you're talking about. Not only that, if you read the introduction to the book, it begins in South Carolina. North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Yeah, North Carolina. And there's a discussion of the response of African Americans to the influx of Latinos. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, the people that are most affected by this book and really have embraced this most have been African Americans because they realize that they are under siege. I'll use that word without any apology. You talk to people in South Central, you talk to them in Compton, when I was on a radio program, the Tom Pope Show out of Washington, D.C., it's a PBS type thing. We would go on the air, we would talk, and then he'd come off the air and he'd say, yeah, Nick, he said, there was an area here in Washington, D.C. that was all African American. And now you think half of El Salvador moved in. It was that. And you know what? He's right. I was in Washington, D.C. circa 1967. I was a summer intern at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. It was called Chocolate City mostly because it was largely African American doing everything. I go back for this book tour on this book. It's largely Latino. This book does not say you can never have an alliance. You have never had an alliance, and you will never have an alliance. It says you cannot presume there is an alliance simply because we are peoples of color.
But where are the scholarly treaties, man? Where are the major studies where people have made the argument that this was a natural alliance? That's what I'm waiting on you to hear you say. I've never heard, and maybe I'm been out of it because I'm retired, but I've never heard somebody say that was going to be a natural alliance. I've heard people call for it in their political rhetoric. I've heard people say, let's form the alliance. In your book, you talk about Jesse, Sharpton, a couple of Latino activists, and you say they call for it. But there has not been any kind of strategic plans that I know of where somebody will sit down and say, we're going to map out how we're going to build this alliance over the next 10 years. And I don't know it. I don't know if the document exists.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, I have 2 comments to start off with. I'm gonna say it because you're a writer, and I know you're gonna keep on writing, and I just want to say it because I think it should be cleared up. Mexicans don't come here free will. They come here because they're hungry. They come here because they have need in Mexico and Central America, South America.
Absolutely.
Not free will. And second of all, I think that we are colonized here. If you go down to LA, if you go down to South Central, and you live there, and you do live amongst black people, Mexicans, Central Americans, Salvadorians, you're gonna notice that laws that apply to Anglo America don't apply to the people in those neighborhoods. Therefore, you are in a cluster, in a small geography, that you do feel alienated and you do feel colonized.
But it's not that's not the definition of a colonizing activity.
If you go to Westwood, you have the richest communities there, okay? And you have enclaves of communities with the lowest incomes. That's colonization. Why? Because those people are being utilized to keep those people rich, to keep them cómodos. You know what I mean? Second of all, I think we need to distinguish, going back to your book, people in power that are threatened by say like new changes, and that don't want to see that power go. Their personal power.
Correct.
Their personal power.
Correct.
Okay, because I don't think that most people out on in offices, I think that once you're there, I'm sorry to say it, but you forget about the people you're working for. Okay, and they hold on to personal power, not the power of the group they represent, but personal power. Most of the examples that you have on there, that's holding on to personal power, not the power of the people they represent. Okay, and third of all, in natural alliances, they do happen. They happen in school. I grew up in South Central. My best friends were black. Jamal, Booga, they were my homies. Those were natural alliances, and they keep on happening. We come together as writers, artists now, and we do see South Central as an internal colony. And maybe the broader America hasn't accepted that. The academy hasn't accepted it, but it's true and it's real. Can't think.
And I know that your question was named.
Let me make a couple of responses. First of all, the immigrant from Mexico does have free will. I mean, if you can argue, no, that he could stay there and become the activist that you had to create and foment the kind of student movement you had in Mexico City that resulted in the massacres of Tlatelolco. Okay, so they do have free will. The fact that they can come here and for their benefit, for economic benefit, is something that is absolutely true. It's something that cannot be denied. My own position on illegal immigration is not going to stop. You can't stop it. You know, whether it's Republican, Democrats, it doesn't matter. But to tell me that they don't have free will is to really deny them a very fundamental human right. They do have free will, and they exercise it by coming here.
But let me ask you something. You say in the book that a whole part of your book argues that they have been invited, right? That's what you said. You said they have been invited because there is a labor market for the illegal, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. What happens if you turn that labor market off? What happens if you turn the labor market that they need?
Mexico will fall into disarray.
Okay, so the question of free will is excuse me, the man's question of free will is unaddressed, man.
Sure it is.
When my mom came from Mexico to the United States, she wasn't thinking about like staying out there so that I could starve. Okay, she was thinking about she wants this child.
But
to
did
grow.
she exercise?
She says I don't have a choice. I can stay here and he could die, or I could go to the U.S. and he could live, and that's what happened.
Okay, let's move on to another question. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to Mario's question because, you know, you brought up Samuel Huntington.
Right.
You know, and what's really significant, I think why, you know, the emotional level rises a bit is because people perceive this as a very dangerous project, intellectual project, because of the way it gets used and the way it gets articulated. For instance, you do open the book talking about the influx into the South in North Carolina.
That's right.
But you rely on one newspaper story, and you fail to mention that in North Carolina, Black Workers for Justice has organized with Mexican workers, with Valdemar Velasquez and the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. So the question is, why do you selectively choose some stories and not the other? If we are truly going to put it on the table and examine the new social reality, you know, it becomes very, very dangerous. And I think part of the problem here, and I have to agree with Hardy, I think there is sort of a personal axe being ground here between certain Chicano intellectuals and the Chicano movement. The discourse of colonialism, the Third World Strike, I found a caricature, quite frankly, of what the Third World Strike was about. I'm a historian. I've written a history of the Third World Strike, so I know that.
And I lived through it.
Well, everybody's got different stories, don't they? And see, one of the things that you do as a historian, you can't just rely on one source, because one source does not make a truth. You have to talk to many different people. And this is going back again to the thing about the newspaper article. But the thing is that all of the groups that you deal with too are all petty bourgeois leaders. You don't deal with trade unions. You don't deal with community groups dealing with police brutality. You don't interview youth that are involved in, like, say, hip-hop culture. Because if you were to do that, if you were to talk to people in the Bay Area, for instance, that organized around Prop 21, you would find that Black and Latinos did unite. And they were able to articulate a politics of alliance building. Because quite frankly, the presumption of alliance doesn't exist. It's the presumption of conflict, which quite frankly your book fuels, you know, and why there's such emotion. It's you know, I think you need to be true to the entire sort of historical and contemporary record, you know, like not relying on one newspaper article.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to read one of your quotes from the book,
Sure.
and then something that you mentioned within the presentation. Your quote is, however, when all is said and done, and the historical and cultural differences between various Latino groups are discussed, Latino leaders invariably resort to the umbrella terms Latino or Hispanic, sweeping all differences under this label.
That's correct.
Okay, that's the biggest claim in the book, and at least for me. And then you spoke of this Puerto Rican commentator, I remember it was a radio show, in the background saying, well, he's really talking about Mexicans, but this is not what's happening with us here,
Right.
you know. And as a Puerto Rican, I have to mark myself that way.
Right.
Because I feel that, you know, like Hardy was emphasizing, the assumption of a Latino group is like huge in this book.
That's right.
I don't claim that identity. I'm not a Latina, I'm a Puerto Rican. And a Puerto Rican has at the heart of it black and white. And black and white is still under contestation within Puerto Rican experience, so that when Puerto Ricans come to this country, dark Puerto Ricans are pulled into the African American blackness by virtue of white supremacy, and light Puerto Ricans are compelled to become part of whiteness, and that's the division. And the ones that tend to claim an alliance with Latinos tend to be those lighter ones, you know. So Latino is very much a racial category, you know, that everybody's being drawn to by white supremacist America, you know. But there is no such thing as Latinos, as your Puerto Rican said. There's Puerto Ricans, there's Dominicans, there's Cubans, there's a bunch of other Latinos that are really involved in this black-white dynamic, you know, and I think that your book relies on erasing those people. So basically you have a Mexican or Chicano or elite sort of experience that you extrapolate to a bunch of other groups that are not having that experience. And my experience has been one of, within my own department, It is not an African American studies department as much in the PhD level. It is not a Black studies, it's an African diaspora studies department, because there's an awareness of Blackness as very differentiated, and of Latinoness as part of Blackness. You know, so for me, it's and it was weird like to hear this slippage. Your title says Black, but your conversation says African Americans. You know,
They're interchangeable.
so they're not. But that's the whole.
No, wait, look. I mean, look. If you want to get absolutely politically correct on
No,
it,
what I'm saying-
let me finish. Let me finish. I struggled with that, whether I was going to say Black or African American. I mean,
I'm talking about Black Latinos.
Afro Latinos.
Exactly, and I think
Yes.
your book relies on erasing them from the picture. You know, and the thing is that
How many
all
Afro Latinos are there? Tell me.
there, you spoke about the Dominican majority.
No.
And the
Tell me how many Afro Latinos there are.
Well, are you
In the
lying?
40 million Latinos that we have in the United States, how many Afro Latinos are there?
Well, you spoke of the New York experience, and you
No, let me. But how many are there?
well, you tell me you're the one who's relying on census figures. I
In
am not talking
the
about.
2000 census, 100,000 Latinos identified themselves as Black. I didn't bring the article with me.
And that is part and parcel of the battle that happens when a Latino, Puerto Rican or Dominican comes into the U.S. and must identify as something.
But
you have a choice.
you're escaping my question. My question was, how many Afro
The
Latinos?
census cannot reveal that. It cannot.
You know
And
why?
I think the point is being missed. The point is being missed. Blackness is part and parcel of what all those national identities have to deal with when they come here into the U.S.
Well-
And Black Latinos know that best.
Okay, then
Okay. So Black Latinos know that best, but not focusing on the experiences of Black Latinos in this book is erasing the fact that this is not about Latino-ness. This is about the colonial experience that we all have, that we're all African, Indian, and European. And when you come here, you have to face that, and you have to make choices.
What
I'm not-
colonial experience? There is no colonial experience. Excuse me, where in the hell do you get the idea that when you come from Puerto Rico to the United States voluntarily, or you come from Chiapas, Mexico to the United States voluntarily, that it is a colonial experience? How do you get there?
In our case,
It's a territory. Puerto Rico. Wait, you have one.
Order in the court.
I just wanted to make 2 points. The first one is, I don't know if you might understand the term colonialism when applied to Mexicans, but let me just give you an example. This year, they built the largest Costco, the largest Walmart, right at the feet of the Teotihuacan pyramids.
No, I read about it, yes.
And you know, colonialism, economic colonialism, in terms of controlling the political apparatus that you read and you were saying, you know, it's all messed up in Mexico, is true. But it's a different form of colonialism that is not taking the territory in a sense, but controlling the political power and controlling the economic power.
and cultural.
And culture. Thank you. The second point that I wanted to make is regarding stories from the streets, right? Since you only focus on elite stories or political stories dealing with the political system. In 1999, there was a war in New York City, a street war, between the Latin Kings and the Bloods.
Yes.
They were slashings every day of African Americans and Latinos. The Latin Kings sent someone to talk to the Bloods in LA,
Were the Latin Kings Puerto Rican or Mexican?
Puerto Ricans.
Okay.
And the Latin Kings and the Bloods united, and they started going neighborhood by neighborhood to talk to the Bloods, and they created a truce based on the experiences and the techniques used in the LA truces and the peace treaties. So the cooperation of these two communities might not be at the elite level or more evident, but there's all these kinds of stories of cooperation between these communities.
No, again, I repeat, I never said that there was not cooperation There hasn't been cooperation, there hasn't been alliance. What I'm saying is there cannot be a presumption of alliance. Now, Hardy disagrees with me. He says, where's this presumption? Well, do you honestly believe that in the 1970s, between the late 1960s, all the way to the late 1970s, there was not a presumption of an alliance between Latinos and African Americans?
Yeah.
There was.
Excuse me.
No, yes or no, I'm sorry.
Yes or no, we're not in court. Hold on. Listen, I'm not arguing with you, Nick. I'm not arguing with you that the rhetoric that the call for did not happen. I'm saying to you that everybody to a certain extent knew that was the problem, but a lot of things that changed in the political movement started on university campuses, started with small groups talking about it. And if you hadn't used the internal colonialism model, what it would have allowed you to do was it would have allowed you to place the blacks in LA, in the section of LA. It would have allowed you to say, what happened in LA was, and I lived there, in Compton, was that first grade you said that all black. Compton used to be segregated right down Alameda. White folks on one side, black folks on the other side of the women. So that was Compton. Let me finish, okay? Now, what happened? The Latinos came in, and they moved there. And in fact, what happened? You never really discussed. You mentioned, but you never really discussed how they manipulated that whole question. How, and you make a point in your book. You say that all you're arguing about is public sector jobs. Now, listen, you're talking about bourgeois public sector jobs.
Bourgeois public sector.
Excuse me. Because the only people you quote are the leadership of these unions. You don't quote people, the rank and file, okay? Now, all I'm saying to you is this. That if you look at LA, what happened in LA was there was a lot of jobs after World War II. Southgate, Huntington Park, Linwood, all those places had jobs. What happened was blacks were working there. That's how Watts got started. That whole community. They had all these jobs. What happened is, after around 65, these jobs started pulling out. Okay? And the only thing you had left in the black labor force, primarily, if you wasn't a longshoreman and you went to Long Beach, was the only thing that you had left was jobs in the public sector. And the Latinos were not going to get into those jobs at that particular time. So they set up a kind of a colonial elite. I'm going to put it in quotes so you don't get mad. A colonial elite. All right? And so what happened is that you had the first generation of blacks, the black middle class coming out of those neighborhoods. And so then the Latinos come in and try to take good of the population. You say, go down there, and they say, hey, we want our share. And then you then tell us that the blacks were just going to stand there and say, come on in? That doesn't even make sense.
That's right. That doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. And they didn't do it. And then you tell us, oh, you had all this tension.
We had the tension. It's there.
But of course, but the fact is, that's clearly understandable. What's unique about that? Every other ethnic group goes through the same thing.
That's exactly right. And
so what's unique about it?
I'm not saying anything's unique about it. What I'm saying is it's something that nobody has focused on in terms of. But by the way, you didn't answer the question. Even though you're an academic, you're entitled to ramble on, you never answered the question. The question was, isn't it true in the late 1960s, all the way through the late 1970s, there was a presumption that there was an alliance between Latinos and African Americans?
The only one I know of, Nick, that I participated in was the Third World Strike, and that definitely wasn't an alliance. The Third World Strike was an alliance.
That is not what I asked you. What I asked you was there not the presumption?
It was here. Anyway,
I don't know. That's not a question.
Before we run out of time, let me share a bit of news here that tells us that the alliance between African Americans and Latinos in particular also is another side of the coin. It's happening, like I mentioned earlier, but
Sure.
even in the area of electoral politics, okay, believe it or not. In Houston, which is one of your case studies, I don't know if you met African American Congresswoman Sheila Jackson, but she introduced the most comprehensive, she has introduced the most comprehensive immigration reform proposal so far ever, and that's H.R. 4885. It has no provision for temporary workers. Jackson instead proposes to legalize undocumented people who have lived 5 years in the U.S., have some understanding of English and U.S. culture, and have no criminal record. These are hardworking, tax-paying individuals. My system would give them permanent legal residency. And she goes on to say, other things that I don't have time to tell you, but basically this is a bill that's been signed by 21 co-sponsors, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including California's, my hero, Barbara Lee, and Michigan's John Conyers. For many years, the caucus has been unspoken, as we know, on a lot of different issues. Now they're saying that it's time, to take a proactive stance in terms of immigration reform. And she says that the rights of minorities in this country are still a work in progress, and I add to that coalition of work in progress. But that the rights of minority, even though they're a work in progress, nonetheless, we have to recognize that the laws of America were broken as they related to African Americans, that we have to fix them. Now we have to fix other laws to end discrimination against immigrants and ipso facto Latinos in society. So, I think I wanted to close on an optimistic note to take away some of your negativity in it. I know Nick didn't want to on purpose do this, but what has happened, unfortunately, even though some of the African American individuals talk to tell you otherwise, I can tell you that your book, unfortunately, has been contributing to perpetuating the divisions between people amongst people of color.
I've heard, by the way, that's the other argument that criticism is usually made. Isn't this nothing more than an example of divide and conquer? I mean, I have heard that up to here. You know what? Let me finish. So I said, my response was, okay, you tell me in Compton, where the whites were manipulating the African Americans against the Latinos and Latinos against African Americans. You tell me in Miami, where the whites were manipulating the Cuban Americans against the African Americans. I mean, the idea that somehow we are incapable of having our own antipathies simply because we are peoples of color is a ridiculous statement.
Let me ask you a question.
Is that true? Well, let me finish.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah, well, let me finish. We're not in a courtroom.